got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness. I got a song and I don't fear sadness.
Welcome everybody to our keynote event this afternoon with Mary Robinson. We're delighted to have here with us, and who has travelled all the way from Lake Como, through Milan, through Germany, Frankfurt, to Logan Airport, to here today to be with us to celebrate Earth Day. It's a huge honour to have you here, Mary, with us. And I will be introducing Mary in a moment more formally. But first, a few words of thanks. At our opening this morning, I had occasion to express deep gratitude to all of our wonderful members of the Guestbook team who've been collaborating over the last few months to make this possible. Colleagues, graduate students, undergrads. So I won't repeat their names now, just offer a collective vote of very heartfelt thanks to you all again. And I also want to very briefly thank our numerous sponsors. Again, I enumerated them this morning and they're all marked on our cards, without whom this would not be possible. But I do want to re-thank a few of the sponsors who are particularly responsible for supporting Mary Robinson's talk this evening. In particular, the Philosophy Department's Fitzgibbon's Lecture Series, so a special nod to Dermot Moore and Vanessa Rumble and Paula Perry, the Institute of Liberal Arts and the Irish Studies program here at Boston College, so special thanks to Dean Greg Kelchar, Mary Crane, Rob Savage and Guy Biner. And finally, to the Irish-American Partnership, I'm delighted to see Mary Sugru here this evening, and the Irish Consulate in Boston, thank you Shane, for their very generous support. Now, before our conversation with Mary Robinson, I have the pleasure of announcing two Guestbook annual awards, very briefly. The first is the Guestbook Write the World Prize for Best Youth Essay on the theme of Hosting Earth. The second is the Guestbook James Mahoney Award for Outstanding Achievement in Narrative Hospitality. In this instance, the Eco-Hospitality of Climate Justice. So, the first award, Guestbook Write the World Award. The management of this first award in Eco-Hospitality is thanks to a creative collaboration between our Guestbook Executive Manager, Peter Clapes, and Lisa Cochran, Education Director for Write the World. And we're very grateful to you both. Write the World was founded in 2012 at Harvard University's Advanced Leadership Initiative. It's a vibrant online community of over 35,000 high school writers in more than 100 countries around the globe. Young writers come to Write the World to draft and publish their work, respond to weekly prompts in a variety of genres, from environmental writing, particularly the case for this prize, to poetry to flash fiction. They exchange feedback with peers around the globe, join writing workshops, and more. Write the World also provides resources for teachers to create engaging writing communities within their classrooms. So, our Guestbook Write the World invitation on the theme of Hosting Earth reached young writers in over 100 countries in the last 6 months. We received 64 published drafts and 39 final submissions. The final entries were from the following countries: US, UK, Nigeria, India, Taiwan, Ireland, Sri Lanka, Canada, Japan, and Albania. And after much deliberation, we've chosen to offer the award to Ezimadu Orji, a 17-year-old student from Nigeria who was dancing for joy when he heard yesterday that he had received the prize. And his essay will be available in both written and spoken form on our Guestbook website shortly, guestbookproject.com. But all of you who've registered for the conference, we will be sending you a recording of that. Secondly, the James Mahoney Guestbook Award. James Mahoney, or Jimmy, as he was known to family and friends, was a great lover of the earth. He passed away in a tragic biking accident 2 years ago and left a huge gap in the lives of all those who knew and loved him. Jimmy was one of the founding members of Guestbook and also personally one of my closest friends since I moved from Ireland to live in Boston in 1999. I recall many long local walks and talks in Weyburn and Wachusett's native names, where we discussed possibilities for the numerous Guestbook projects, many of which came to fruition over the years. In particular, we spent many hours brainstorming over the signature project of Guestbook, namely narrative hospitality, exchanging stories, changing history, a project which we established 12 years ago with fellow Guestbook directors Sheila Gallagher and Elise Zoli. In addition to his extraordinary contribution to Guestbook, Jimmy also did sterling work with the Global Climate and Energy Project and the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford University. I know he would have been very happy to witness today's conference on eco-hospitality. Jimmy was an exemplary host and guest of this Earth, and I've no doubt he would be particularly glad that Guestbook will be holding a workshop on ecology and indigenous healing with several elders from the Lakota tribe in the fall. We also thought of Jimmy yesterday, and several of you were here for that ceremony, when on Earth Day we planted the three sisters, three seeds, the corn, the bean, and the squash, in Connolly Garden here in Boston College in Jimmy's memory and in celebration of the Earth. And of these three particular seeds, which as many of you may know if you've read Kimmerer's book, Robin Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, were the three symbiotic seeds of mutual growth. For the Wampanoag tribe here in Massachusetts, but also for several other tribes in the New England area. And anybody who hasn't received your little recyclable bag with a notification on how to plant the three seeds, they grow together. They each need each other to grow in a sort of a mutually enhancing way. There are these little bags on your seats with the citation on the three sisters, three seeds by Kimmerer on the back of your card. If you didn't get one, we have more up here, and I'd be delighted to give each of you one before you leave, so you can go and plant the seeds. I think finally that Jimmy would have appreciated the following land acknowledgement of Boston College regarding the very place on which we now stand. I quote, "Boston College's campus sprawls across places now known as Chestnut Hill, Newton, and Brighton, in a space that was called Shawmut by its original inhabitants from the Wachusett tribe and their neighbors from the Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations, indigenous peoples who lived here for over 10,000 years. We honor their memory and invoke their ancient native earth blessing, Mit Akwi Ashin, all are relations. Relations here understood indigenously as a giant web of connections, extending from the first natural elements of earth, fire, air, and water to all human, animal, mineral, and vegetal beings, from the earliest generations of time to future generations yet to come." So it is a great pleasure now to call on our Guestbook Co-Director of Communications, Urwa Hamid, to present the Guestbook James Mahoney Award in Narrative Hospitality to Mary Robinson, the first recipient of this prize. Urwa is graduating in May here in Boston College with a BA degree in International Relations and Political Science before moving on to a law degree in Brown University. Last year, at the age of 18, she won several fellowships, which enabled her to travel back to her native Pakistan to write a book entitled Steering Towards Change, Women Politicians Challenging Patriarchy, Class and Power in Pakistan. I think we have a picture of it actually, if you, maybe it was already shown. Anyway, there you go. So I now ask Urwa to say a few brief words before presenting a copy of her own book and the James Mahoney Award to Mary Robinson. So up you come, Urwa. There you go.
From being elected as the first female president of Ireland to serving as the United Nations Commissioner of Human Rights, Mary Robinson has been a true inspiration to all of us. With each step of our journey and each social initiative she undertook, Mary Robinson has paved an enlightened way for women and girls all around the world to lead by example and to create change by hard work. As a young author myself, who advocates equal rights for women and girls all around the world, I take inspiration and admiration from the decades of her life that she has dedicated to fighting for social justice. I'm very honored to be sharing the monumentous occasion of celebrating Earth Day 2022 with Mary Robinson, who has served as a UN Special Envoy of Climate Change. I'm truly humbled to be presenting the James Mahoney Award and my book to Mary Robinson for her lifetime of service to us all and to planet Earth. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So, now to our keynote event of the day, our conversation with Mary Robinson on climate justice. A few brief words of introduction. Mary, as many of you will know, was the former President of Ireland. Now, what's the technical word now, Mary? You reminded me earlier. Ir Uachtaráin Héireann, there you go. Former President of Ireland, former UN Commissioner of Human Rights, former UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, and a member of the Elders and the Club of Madrid, and recipient of numerous honors, including the US Presidential Medal of Freedom. Mary is the founder and president of the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, and author of Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, which we've been discussing and exploring and reading in several classes here in Boston College this spring. On a personal note, I was incredibly impressed as a student growing up in Ireland by Mary's role as an inspirational member of the Irish Senate and a pioneering campaigner for human, civic, and women's rights in Ireland and abroad. Indeed, I recall my first actual meeting with Mary on a march for her presidential election in Dublin, when our 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, who I was carrying on my shoulders, cried out, "I want to see Mary Robin Hood." There was a childhood song in Ireland that went, Robin Hood, riding through the glen. Robin Hood with his merry men. Steals from the rich, gives to the poor, Robin Hood. So Mary, as a good member of the Labour Party, I think, was good at the redistribution of wealth. In any case, my daughter was delighted to meet Mary Robin Hood Robinson. So, as Ireland's first woman president, Mary Robinson opened many new windows of individual liberty, social justice, and cultural awareness, inviting a radical enlargement of heart and mind, which helped prepare the way for the signing of the Good Friday Peace Agreement in 1998. In the last 2 decades, after her presidency and her outstanding role as UN Commissioner of Human Rights, Mary has devoted herself passionately and effectively to the pursuit of climate justice, declaring, in one instance in her book, that we must become good guests of the earth, an aspiration very close to our own Guestbook mission of hosting Earth. Dostoevsky famously declared that only beauty can save the world. I think Mary Robinson would agree, but perhaps add, if beauty can save the world, justice but must make it good. So let the conversation begin. Mary asked, when we first discussed this some months ago, the possibility of giving a talk here. She said that she would like it to be in the form of a conversation, so we would all be in dialogue together. So I'm going to ask Mary to take the chair, and I will start with 1 or 2 questions, and then open it pretty rapidly to the floor so that we can engage in this promised dialogue. So, Mary Robinson. So, first question. In your book, Climate Justice, Mary, you tell stories. You tell the stories of little people, in a way, people who were not initially in positions of political power, people, many of them women, in disadvantaged community and certainly subject to climate emergency, in countries as far afield as Alaska, Uganda, Chad, Vietnam, the Marshall Islands, and so on. So my question to you is this: why the storytelling method? And why choose the little narratives of these people over the grand narratives that you are obviously very familiar with as former Commissioner of Human Rights? Is there an issue of sort of a grassroots, bottom-up movement for climate justice, which then can maybe complement the top-down?
Well, first of all, I came to understand that we weren't able to grasp the climate story because of the way we were hearing about it, and that we had to move to storytelling. That became very clear to me. And then I wanted storytelling about the experts. Who knows more about the impacts of climate than somebody who's trying to defend her community from the absolute reality of it? So that was, and these were not small people to me. These were, first of all, my heroes, and secondly, experts in addressing the issues. And the book is very strategic. I mean, I have, other people I could have included, but I wanted it to tell stories. And the interesting thing is, I was determined that it would try and be, as global as possible. And I was very keen to get stories in the United States. At that time, it was much more difficult than it would be now, because the climate impacts have moved to the Northern Hemisphere. And now we're understanding what the South has been suffering for decades and decades. Not responsible, but suffering. I hope we'll come to all the layers of injustice that we need to talk about. And so there were 2 stories. There was the impact after the Hurricane Katrina of this wonderful woman who, was a great character apart from everything else. African-American, lived on the wrong side of the tracks, had her lovely salon and her home that were white in East Biloxi. And Sharon learned what it is to suffer absolute poverty. I remember her in Copenhagen, which was all of us, Constance O'Kellett, Sharon and myself, all of us, it was our first climate conference. And Constance called Sharon Mississippi Girl. And they sat together and they talked about the humility of having your entire life not wiped out. Now Sharon got a FEMA trailer and but it was really what she did, the accidental activist, in fighting back, in working to change her circumstances and working to change other people's circumstances, etc. And that was exactly what Constance was doing.
And Constance was from where?
From Uganda.
From Uganda.
From Uganda, yeah.
Sharon is from Alabama.
Yes.
Yeah.
From East Biloxi.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other story in the United States was in Alaska. Patricia Cochrane. I met Patricia first at a big event in London for women that Tina Brown had organised, and one of Tina's great events. And she was there as a climate scientist from Alaska. And I spoke to her about what it was like, and I was so impressed by the way she told her story as a scientist, because she was a scientist who absolutely loved, and she was an indigenous scientist who, felt this enormous connection with Earth and was watching it crumbling and being destroyed, in watching the erosion of seawater, etc. And so she had a great social conscience about it all. And so they were two of the stories. If I was writing now, I would not have trouble, I think, finding far more stories of the more advanced world. But the difference is that I was deliberately choosing also those in the developed world who were not responsible for the injustices of climate.
And it reminds me indeed of what John Manderson was saying in the talk, which we heard beforehand, Fish Live in the Water, that very often fishermen and women, working, as we know from Coda, the recent film, men and women fish the sea, have a hands-on sort of knowledge of the mackerel just not being there, whereas the scientists are there with, sometimes with their charts and trying to figure things out, in the financiers, but the grassroots know in a way, right? In a very special way. And you also chose primarily women, not exclusively, but primarily women. Was there a reason for that?
Can I just apologise a little bit for the single plastic? But
Not your fault, Mary.
I've been coming a long journey. I need a little bit of water, so if I may, I'll take a sip before I answer.
Indeed.
And now you'll have to repeat the question.
Yes, no, just the grassroots experience and that so many of the women
I do often joke about that. I have to say that there are 11 stories essentially in the book, as some of you will know, and 9 of them involve women. But I always say there are 2 good men, very good men. I mean, it's about the proportion I wanted, because 80% of the food in the world is produced, in the developing world, is produced by women. Yet they own much less of the land, they get much less access to credit, you name it, So I wanted to bring out these things. And I subsequently, it's another way of telling stories, moved to a podcast called Mothers of Invention. And I did it initially with a young Irish comedian based in New York. She was 8 years old when I was elected president. Maeve Higgins is her name. And she was already well known and has become even more known because she's made films now and done other things. But we met as a trial,
right?
And we hit it off famously because she was half respectful of me. That was half the humour. I mean, I remember one of her first questions on air to me was, "Mary, when Nick and yourself went out on your first date, who paid?" I know, my kind of response to that is that, well, Maeve didn't know anything about climate, but she knew how to ask questions. And we kept interviewing special people from the South. And many people had their questions asked for them in a way that really helped them to understand the climate issue. But the reason I mentioned it is I want to be a bit provocative here. In our podcast, we had a byline that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. And I always explain, maybe would never bother, but I always explain that climate change is a man-made problem, is generic. It means we're all responsible, basically. And a feminist solution is increasingly the solution that we should all, men and women, young men and young women, boys and girls, should be embracing. Because it is the way in which we have to address the issues. It's the problem solving, it's the inclusive, it's the listening to all the voices, it's the multifaceted, it's all of those things. It's grown significantly out of the feminist movement, but now I'm happy to say more and more men acknowledge and see themselves as bringing to bear a feminist approach. They may or may not call it that. That doesn't matter. It's the approach that matters.
Right. Very good. At one point in your book, you quote the motto, "Impossible is not a fact, it is an attitude." Do you have hope today that the impossible is still possible? 4 years after you wrote the book, have things got better or worse? Is justice climate doable, or is it a utopian aspiration?
I think the window is closing. That's the really worrying thing. And I'm so conscious of that almost every morning when I wake up. I became very conscious of it when I had quite a sort of public television role at COP26. I'm now chair of the elders. The first chair was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and when he retired, Kofi Annan took the chair, and he sadly died in 2018, so I'm now filling those big shoes. And as chair of the elders, I was asked by Sky Television, which was the official channel of COP26, would I come on for the first couple of days and at the very end, as a kind of analyst, if you like. And I remember it was the first of the last segment, so about 2 or 3 days before the end. I came on, and Climate Action Tracker, which is a very good NGO which tracks the pledges that governments make, that business makes, that investment makes. And there have been a lot of focus, especially by the UK, because it was their COP that they were chairing. And Boris Johnson wanted to talk about what the private sector was doing, what investment was doing, less about what governments were doing in a way. Anyway, Climate Action Tracker added up all the pledges that had been made and calculated that if everybody actually fulfilled all those pledges, which was by no means the case going on, we were facing a world of 2.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, 2.4 degrees Celsius. And I learned this just before I went on air, and I was asked something like your question, and I started to talk about Climate Action Tracker and a word of 2.4%, and I remember I kind of actually lost it. I just got very emotional, because I thought to myself, that means that anybody under 70 in the world today who lives a bit longer will face a horrible world. Anybody under 30 will face for very significant parts of their life. All our children and grandchildren. And it kind of really hit me. That's what we're talking about. In other words, we're not on course for a safe world. We're not. And yet we don't talk about climate very much, do we?
No.
We don't know how to, we don't. So that's why storytelling is so important.
At the end of the book, you do have that moment when you say, you know, you look forward to 2050, and you ask yourself, it's sort of a thought experiment, what will it be like for my 6 grandchildren, right? And you do sort of raise a rallying cry, you know. One of the words you use, I was going to quote it, but I left the book in my bag, connection, that there must be connection, interconnection. What sort of practical steps would that involve, that element of connection and awareness?
Well, first of all, you know, when Nelson Mandela brought the elders together in 2007, he made it very clear that we must work on peace, human rights, sustainable issues, but we must always bring hope. So, and actually, we will not solve any problems really unless we have the kind of energy of seeing the possibilities of it. And I love one of his very short phrases. Nelson Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." Nice phrase. It always seems impossible until it is done. So at the moment, the window is getting pretty difficult. Can I kind of thread how important climate justice was in Paris and bring us up to date on why that's so important, including at COP26? I remember, because I was the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General at the time, before Paris, so I was witness to the planning by the French presidency, which was quite intensive before Paris. Paris had to work. Copenhagen had failed, Cancun and others had retrieved a bit, but we actually had to have a conference that gave us the hope that things were going to change. It was important that President Obama and President Xi decided that there would be a climate agreement. They met on it in China and they spoke about it, etc. That was fine. But actually, the most significant measure and most significant step that was taken was done because of pressure from climate justice. Pressure from the small island states, the indigenous peoples, civil society, young people. We marched in the street in Paris, and the mantra was 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. And just at the final decision time, a high ambition coalition was formed. And the head of that coalition was Tony de Bruyn, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. Then the EU joined, the US joined, other countries joined. What was the sole purpose of the High Ambition Coalition? It was to ensure that the goal adopted by the Paris Agreement contained 1.5. And if you remember, the goal as it was set out was that we have to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius and work for 1.5 degrees. And that's essentially the wording. It's all above pre-industrial standards. So the irony was that the scientists had not studied this. And the global climate scientists had not looked at the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. So they were asked by the Paris Agreement, study that please and bring in a special report. They're reporting all the time, assessment. We just had a 6th assessment. So this was a special report. And it was brought out in October 2018. And that special report on staying on 1.5 degree warming, it's called, was extraordinarily important because the scientists said there is a huge difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And now I'm simplifying slightly in a way that scientists don't, but this was the essence of what they were saying if you read the longer version, as they say. They made it clear that in that time, bad things would probably happen. First of all, the coral reefs would probably disappear entirely. Secondly, the Arctic ice might well disappear. And thirdly, the permafrost would melt. And permafrost is very substantial around the Arctic, for example, the huge areas. It's already melting a bit, more than we would like. And it would throw up not just carbon, but also methane, which, as we know, is more lethal in the short term. It has a shorter lifespan, but it's more lethal. And therefore, that would all accentuate these tipping point problems. So the scientists at the time said, therefore, the whole world has to stay at 1.5 degrees. And to do that, again, it's doable if you have the political will, that's in the report. And they said you just have to reduce global emissions of fossil fuel by 45% by 2030. You have 12 years, they said then. Now we have less than 8. We've 7 and something. And we've realized we need to tackle methane very quickly as part of that, which came out of the carbon. Now, the interesting thing, which is positive about COP26, was despite the fact that the pledges are not enough and we're not on target yet, everybody was talking the language of aligning with 1.5. And that's really important. So we know what we have to do. What we have to do is get real about what is harming us. And it's kind of interesting because I remember talking a few years ago to the International Energy Agency, a very conservative body which represents the oil and gas and all the other agencies. And it had just taken on a new director, a Turkish director, Fatih Birol. And he invited me to come and talk to them about climate justice, and that was okay. But I said to myself, this organization is part of the problem. It has now completely changed. And if you read the reports of the International Energy Agency, they're saying, get out of fossil fuel as quickly as possible. We can't do it quickly enough. It's just, it's amazing how significant that is. And yet the power of the fossil fuel lobby is such that we are where we are.
A question that came up very often in the seminars was, if a lot of people are exploring the relationship between ecology and art, and today, indeed this afternoon, art and science, an important partner in the conversation is economics. And indeed, I remember you saying to me, I think it was the last time you visited here, we can't solve the climate crisis without addressing the issue of poverty. So could you maybe say something about the economics of this and the practicality of doing something about that, given the pressures?
Yeah. I think I'd have to tread back to answer your question, really, to talk about the injustices. Because what we can see is all of those injustices are being compounded.
Yeah.
And that's and compounded now by the Ukraine war's impact.
They're getting worse.
They're getting worse.
Yeah.
I didn't say this expressly in the book. I've really been saying it more recently, and I think it's important that we grasp what I often call the layers of injustice. And the first is the one that I do write about, and that was very central, which was realizing, as somebody who, having spent 7 years from 1990 to 1997 as President of Ireland, I spoke about the environment, but I didn't mention climate. It wasn't real. Nobody was speaking about climate. And then I went to the UN, and I learned, oh yes, this is very serious. But there was another part of the UN dealing with it, and I didn't connect it with my world of human rights, gender equality, rights of people with disabilities, all of those things, until I started working in African countries. And it was like an eye-opener.
And that was what year, roughly, Mary, when?
That was 2003, 2004, 2005. I realized I had missed this really important connection. And that then became my passion. I mean, I came to climate through the lens of human rights. So I don't talk about climate change. I talk either about climate justice or climate crisis, climate emergency, whatever strong language you can think of. But I like the climate justice best of all, because I learned that it was impacting far more these African countries, and then I learned small island states, indigenous peoples, and the poorest parts of richer countries, or richer developed countries, or richer emerging economies. They also were suffering. And they were the least responsible, because they were not driving cars, not using central heating, not doing major manufacturing. So, and they were the black and brown and indigenous people of our world. So it's a kind of racial injustice as well. Within that, the gender injustice became striking. That women do have different social roles, different power, sometimes different land rights, different access to credit, different roles in society, all of that. And yet they have to put food on the table, they have to go further and drought for water, etc. And it's they who tend, as my book, the storytelling, tend to try to group together to make their communities resilient. We see it all over the world now. It's the way in which a lot of hard work is being done to try and counter the shocks. So that's the second one. So the third one is the intergenerational injustice. And thankfully, this is now one that young people, Greta Thunberg, yes, but there are millions of young people in the world, and there are millions of children in the world with their Fridays for Future, who are aware that they haven't got the power to make the decisions, and those who have the power are not making the right decisions. Right. And they're very smart, and they're very connected now, and their pressure is helping, but they're becoming very angry and frustrated, as we saw when Greta came out with her blah blah blah, at the Cancun, at the Glasgow COP. So that's the third one. The fourth one is subtle, but I think it's increasingly important in our political world, even in our post-Ukraine world, or in the middle of the Ukraine war world. It's the injustice of the different pathways to development of different regions of the world. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel, so we should appreciate that. We should appreciate the workers in coal and oil and gas, and in our peat, turf. But we should also get off what's destroying us, which is these emissions, as rapidly as possible with just transition. And I talk quite a bit about just transition, as you saw in the book. And just transition absolutely means centralizing the workers in their communities in this green economy and green jobs, and rewinding, like we're rewinding the bogs now in the Midlands in Ireland, quite successfully, I understand. So that's our problem. The problem for developing countries who pledged in Paris, the Paris Agreement in 2015, that they wanted to go as green as possible. To go green, you need upfront expense, you need investment, and they haven't got it. Yeah. It's very hard to get heavy investment for developing countries. Now, Modi managed to screw up quite a bit out of the United States, and India has gone significantly solar, for example, partly because it's got some of the technology that it desperately needed. It's also going coal, still can't fill the gap otherwise. In other words, we're not realizing what we need to be doing in doing it. And the fifth injustice, sorry for taking a bit long on this, the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself. the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. And we have to realize, and it's just worth referencing, we have been stupid enough, and it happened in my lifetime. It happened in the 1950s. We were stupid enough with our industrialized age not to realize that we were taking ourselves out of the Cinderella period of the world, 10,000 years of the Holocene. Never too hot, never too cold. And civilization flourished. And we started extracting too. And we are now in the Anthropocene, which means that it is humans who are affecting more what's happening to climate and climate rupture. And what worries climate scientists more than anything else, because it's not predictable, is when nature will turn and if nature will turn. In other words, at the moment, nature is our great friend. The oceans sink huge amounts of carbon, the forests, particularly rainforests, sink, but we're killing. It's a strange lack of awareness. The planet will thrive without us. It will revive into, probably get back to that Holocene, because we won't have the emissions warming it. We'll be gone because we will have made it unlivable for ourselves. It's hard to believe, and it's really hard to believe how hard it is to get politicians with their policies to keep the focus on exactly that. And it just shows again the power of the fossil fuel lobby. And now you talked about poverty. Climate shocks are causing poverty all over the world now, because it's in the northern hemisphere as well. But the impacts of COVID were not felt equally, to say the least of it. The richer parts of the world were able to put in stability supports, keep people in their, let them work from home, but secure a lot of jobs and so on. Poorer countries were left pretty well on their own. You had that mass exodus from cities initially in India, do you remember, back to the villages, that's right. And then there was the lack of equitable access to vaccines. So at the moment, a lot of countries had to incur high indebtedness because of COVID. And then on top of that, we had the rising costs already accelerated seriously by the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is a terrible war. It's a war on the continent of Europe that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. It's incredibly sad. It's hard to watch. It's hard to believe. But it is causing huge damage also. In Egypt, for example, not the poorest country by any manner of means in Africa, but there'll probably be riots in Egypt because bread has had to increase.
It's the staple diet.
Yeah, the staple diet, and because of the fact that Russia and Ukraine between them are such, the breadbasket of a lot of these, and of fertilizer. So, all of these things are being aggravated, and it's even more important that we get the political will together to tackle them. And yet, obviously, when we're at war, and when the world is more divided between the US and China than it was, for example, at the time of the Paris Agreement, although John Kerry has managed to secure a good agreement, a good relationship with his Chinese counterpart, whom I know very well as well. They work well at a personal level, and they agreed in Glasgow to work well together but nothing's happening fast enough.
Good. Well, look, not good that nothing's happening fast enough, but good moment for you to have a drink of water and for me to open it to the floor. I know there are several people here with questions. First question. Anybody who'd like to go first? Yes, your good self. And we have a microphone here for you. Peter, can you? There we go.
It's good to be with you again. Right now we're below 1.3, 1.5 Celsius. We're below 2 degrees Celsius. But most everybody who's a scientist says that we're going to pass 1.5 about 1930 and 2030. And that by mid-century, will pass 2.0. And there's speculation, well, if we overshoot, we could still exercise decarbonization and elimination of CO2 and methane. But my instincts are that nobody is in a position to know whether we can ever bring that temperature down. Do you know anybody who thinks we can bring the temperature down?
I think you've identified the problem quite well. It's in the recent IPCC report. And there's a feeling that governments like the idea of being able to capture a lot of carbon and somehow save ourselves from ourselves. We haven't seen the proof of that. I mean, there is carbon capture, there's more attention to it. It's very expensive, and there aren't many, good examples, and it's not on a big scale. By far, far more important is that we do what the scientists are telling us to do, and that is cut the emissions by, it's now 43% by 2030. It was 45% a few years ago. I think COVID helped a bit, and there is a peaking of carbon in the industrialized world. The problem now is the emerging economies. There are some scientists who complain that, you see, the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we see are executive summaries of much wider scientific reports. And those executive summaries are agreed by governments. That's the shocking thing. These aren't actually just science reporting. They're science reporting agreed by all of the governments, 195 governments. And what they're saying is unbelievable. And as you say, in this recent report, they talked about capturing, but they didn't say how we would do it.
I've not seen anyone or heard anyone who thinks we can lower the temperature once it rises.
Which is why we have to use the window we have.
And here in Massachusetts, we've adopted regulations to bring down the greenhouse gases by 45% this decade. But we're just one state.
Thank you. Maria, you have a question. Yes.
Thank you very much for this.
Do you want to stand up, Maria?
Yeah. I'll read it better. I'm Maria. I'm from Colombia, South America. And I want to ask you this question about economics that Professor Kearney was bringing. I come from this beautiful country, which is full with rich natural resources. However, it is not clear to us how to achieve greater economic development without destroying our natural resources. And I bring this example. We have now the dilemma of exploiting oil by means of fracking, which it will help us to have money to cover the fiscal gap. But this exploitation will take place in natural reserve areas and will affect seriously the surrounding communities. This dilemma and its solution is discussed to some extent in Climate Justice in your book, especially when it comes to that transition to clean energy. However, I would like to ask if the solution also has to do with rethinking or reimagining an economic system where excessive production and consumption are not the generators of wealth. Like if we need another kind of capitalism, because I think there is the real cause of the injustice. So I would like to know what you think about it.
Well, thank you. It's a really very good question, and the dilemma that you face in Colombia is a dilemma here talked about a lot in Africa. You know, Africa, the whole continent is responsible for less than 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. Why can't we use all the gas that we're now finding? And it's a tricky one, but more importantly, as well as the reduction of emissions, which I've been emphasizing, we do absolutely have to change our economic system. We absolutely have to. because it's an economic system based on growth and production and consumption, and the world cannot sustain it. So we have to, and the truth is, it doesn't mean a bad world, it means a different world. And I'm very keen to encourage, especially younger people, to imagine with us the world that we need to be hurrying towards. We need to be getting a good way towards it in 7.5 years' time, 7.75 years' time, which is 2030. What is this world? It will be much healthier because we won't have the fumes of fossil fuels to anything like the same extent. We all remember, I think, the early days of COVID. We began to, with the spring, we started to hear the birds, the air was fresher, we went out, we communed with nature, we almost refound ourselves. That lovely moment. That would be, our cities will be greener, we'll have farms in cities, our countryside will be rewilding furiously, being very different from the situation that we have now, and we will be consuming less. But there's nothing wrong with that in the rich world, consuming less. And I'm talking about the industrialized parts of the world, or the richer parts of the emerging economies. Because, in fact, we have a terrible throwaway society. We have terrible waste. And we have to get to the circular economy. And if I could just digress for a moment to a memory that I have that's stimulated by your question. I remember going to the Architectural Venice Biennale in 2018, I think it was, because it was being curated, the entire Venice Biennale was being curated by 2 Irish women architects who are friends of mine, Shelley and Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara, brilliant architects, draftsman architects, and they got the responsibility, which was wonderful. And I was asked to go on a panel about it, and I went out there, and I had something prepared on the panel, but actually I changed completely what I said, because as I walked through with Shelley and Yvonne, they had invited architects from around the world to treat the earth as their client. Lovely concept. The earth is your client now. And it was brilliant. It was an insight into this world that would be so much better. Circular economy, green jobs, no waste. I saw in a Bangladesh project for saris that would have otherwise been thrown away. The pieces of them that were being recycled. It was just, and some of the most imaginative were from a wonderful woman, an architect from China, and she had projects in villages in China of how you can reuse and recycle. It was just brilliant, and I was bowled over by the potential of it all. And I was with an indigenous woman the other day, at a women leaders gathering, where we're going to try and get women leaders to stand tall from now for the next 7 years on this issue, to try and see if we can influence things. But she has a byline, I think, what if the world, what if the future is much better than we thought? What if the future is much better than we thought? And I think we have to really think that, And then, it makes a difference, because then why would you aggravate the problem that's going to make it worse? And the other thing, and I say this increasingly in Ireland as well, in a kind of, I have to be, as an ear-utron, as a former president, I have to be careful not to say things too politically, but I try to say, we need to insulate houses, we need affordable energy, not energy poverty, which is happening now, even in Ireland. Some people are being driven into an energy poverty. This should not be allowed by any government, because they should spend our children's money and our grandchildren's money now, because otherwise our children and grandchildren won't have any future. In other words, unless we help people to get to where we need to be, in insulating houses, in having, there are grants now, it's beginning to happen. The commitment of Massachusetts and other places to reduce by 45%. This needs to be the investment policy of everyone. and spend the money to do it. Because when you get there, everything will make sense. Whereas at the moment, there's still a mindset that hasn't grasped how incredibly important it is that we use our imagination and move rapidly. And I think, as women in particular, as women leaders, we're going to try and, use that kind of way of talking about it that will, I hope, make some difference.
It reminds me indeed, before I go to the next question, of something that came up yesterday in the opening event. Jane Marshing, an environmental artist here in Boston, an eco-activist, she said at the end of the class, she was talking with Sheila Gallagher's class, and she said to the student, she said, we, and particularly you, this generation, has to stop being obsessed with apocalypse. We need to get the facts, we need to know how horrible it is, but then we've got to start thinking otherwise.
Yes,
we can't stay with the apocalypse because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. And finally, Howard was talking this morning, has this idea of the wonder horror. Yeah. So we need to register the horror, but then the wonder must come.
I tend to encourage people when I'm talking about climate justice to take 3 steps. And the first step is to make the climate crisis personal in your own life, because actually you should. It's that important. And how do you know you've made it personal? Because you're doing something now, today and tomorrow, you weren't doing yesterday. And it's probably recycling more carefully, it may be changing your diet, or maybe whatever, small thing. But what it does is it means you own your responsibility. You've done something, and you've committed maybe to, I've committed, I'm a jackets person, I've committed not to buy all these jackets, I put things away. Unfortunately, I don't change size.
That's a very nice one, actually.
It's been around for a few years.
You can wear that for a few more.
It's been around for a few years, I'll put it away now for another year, and then I'll come back again. But anyway, that's the first step. Make it personal, because you should, and you'll feel better. Secondly, get angry with those who aren't doing enough. And that's governments, that's business, that's investment, that's the fossil fuel lobby, obviously, that's cities, and try and see who's doing what. Can you help by joining? And there are so many great NGOs and others around the world who are putting pressure on, etc. And then the third thing, and this is the most important, and it's exactly imagine this world we need to be hurrying towards. Unless we're doing that, we're not actually going to have the collective sense of, people change their minds through their heart. We have to get, a real feeling from the heart. We want to get there because it's going to be much better. It's certainly going to be a lot healthier. It's going to be, energy is going to be free because it's going to be, solar, wind, etc. And we're seeing already that it's a lot cheaper, except we need the investment up front, so it's not cheaper initially. So there's a catch in it,
Yeah. It's a very interesting example because, is David Story here? David, are you here? Yeah. David, could you give David the microphone, Peter, or somebody? He raised the example this morning, he was at the Glasgow meeting, of this writer, science fiction writer, who went to Glasgow and then found himself at the centre of attention where the scientists and the economists were coming to him as a writer and saying, give us the details, David. It was a very moving example.
So the author Richard referring to is Kim Stanley Robinson. And his novel, The Ministry for the Future, became a sensation, so much that he was invited to the COP talks to address a number of groups. And very brief thing on the novel, it basically unfolds over 30 years, and it's extremely realistic. It's basically, what would a technologically and politically and economically realistic solution to the climate problem look like? Such that by 2050 or so, humanity more or less gets its arms around the climate problem. So I was very lucky to recognize him in the lunch line one day, and then went over and said hello and said I was teaching his book, and he melted and granted me an hour interview. So that was fascinating. Did you want me to ask her about?
But didn't he actually say to you that many scientists and economists were
More importantly,
pursuing him,
yeah,
asking.
more importantly, central bankers and
Okay.
like big shot finance people have read his book, because the irony is, spoiler alert, around 2050 it's actually central bankers that save the world, because they re-engineer the global financial system to basically incentivize decarbonization of the global energy economy. So that was fascinating to me, because you think about speculation in financial markets, and speculation is what science fiction writers do, and they were turning to him for ideas because they don't know how to do it. Yeah.
Did they have an ethical conscience in that, or were they profiteers just looking for a good idea to make themselves richer?
That's the question I should have asked him when I interviewed him. Hopefully we can ask him that if he comes here next year.
But you had a question too, David, did you?
I did,
Yes.
Madam President, wasn't sure how to address you, but I'll go with Madam President. I have a question about a controversial solution in environmental circles, which is nuclear. And the context of the question is actually the war in Ukraine, because one of the issues here, right, one of the tools that's trying to be used is to cut reliance of Europe on Russian oil and gas. And in the context of Germany, which sort of has the most sway, right? One reason that they rely on natural gas is they denuclearized largely after the Fukushima disaster in I forget when it was. And so there's an argument to be made that because nuclear is the only reliable baseload form of power that doesn't face the intermittency problems of renewables, what role can and should that play in the energy mix of the choices that countries make going forward?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not a fan of nuclear, and I know building nuclear plants has been extremely expensive, usually overruns, and then there's the waste disposal problem that is there. But frankly, because we're in such a short window of time, I know that it doesn't add to the problem with emissions, and therefore I'm hearing about maybe some small nuclear could be potentially a technology. I feel the real focus should be on the renewables, and that's what climate scientists are saying to us as well. Because they're getting so much cheaper, because the battery retention is so much more effective, because they're linking with the grids much more effectively, and so on and so on. We should go with those technologies that have us, move with Mother Earth in a much more, rather than use a technology that has its downsides. There's no doubt about it. But I think it's truth to say, I won't say I've softened on this issue, but I'm not prepared to rule it out entirely, because I agree with my friend in the front row. We have not learned how to, take the emissions out if we keep putting them in at the rate we're doing. It's not that's the real problem, and that's where I really fear when we hear what the scientists say about the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and we're already above 1 degree. It's just really, really very urgent, and we just need a different economic system, and the sooner the storyteller gets the central banks, not in 2050, that's far too late, but now, to take this seriously.
Good. Yes, several hands going up. This gentleman here, and then Z. Yes. There we go. And Nathan, can you give Z? Yes.
Hello, Madam President. It's nice to have you here in Boston. My name is Andre Sheldon, and I'm the Director of Global Strategy of Nonviolence. And the war in Ukraine and COVID and the results of COP26 created a door to change the world. And because with disaster and strife comes opportunity, but we have to be bold. And so I'm here today to ask you to do something special to unite the climate and the peace movement. And the strategy is ready. What if Naomi Klein, Greta Thunberg, Christiana Figueres, and Vandana Shiva, Tina Brown, came together and joined with the women from the peace movement, Beatrice Finn, Arundhati Roy, and others. If they, together, these women could unite all the movements, all the religions, all the mayors and community leaders in every city to promote a new global peace movement. And all of your wonderful accomplishments have put you in a position to bring these women together. And the world needs women now because the war has changed the world in the wrong direction, derailing the efforts of the climate movement. And therefore, we need a peace movement. And there is no cohesive peace movement right now. Until now. Here's a plan that I'd like to present to you. It's an emergency plan. A global movement of nonviolence led by women. But it's not exclusive to women. It's a business plan with the team, the funding, the marketing, and a constructive segment to reverse the direction the war is taking us in.
Very good, Sheldon. I think if you give it to Mary Robinson, she'll read it and I'm sure get back to you, but maybe she could answer your question.
Yes,
because we have lots of young people trying to get in here, so we're desperate to read your peace plan, but not now. So Mary, if you could respond.
Well, I think you responded for me.
Thank you. All right, CA. There you go. Yes.
Hi. I hope I address you correctly, Madam President. I want to ask you a question. So, based on what I heard from you, you think that there's these poor people in Africa, in this developing country that suffer from climate the most is people that do not benefit from the technology that hurts our climate. And then when we want to address this economic problem, it just brings me to Professor Kearney when he talked about Robin Hood at the beginning, that we are kind of cutting the rich and serving the poor. And if this old iron superhero is doing that by his bow and his heart for justice.
Are you talking about Robin Hood?
Robin Hood, yeah, Robin Hood.
I'm afraid to say he was English, but we'll own it for
now.
now.
Okay, I'm sorry, I never
Close enough.
Yeah. But if this old hero is doing this by his bow and his courage, what should ours to do? So in this age, when we are going through a less violent, more inclusive way, what would be the core spirit for this new age Robin Hoods to address this question and to bring forth changes?
And you are a citizen of mainland China, correct?
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think, may I answer you in slightly climate terms, because I've emphasized the injustices and that the world which benefited from fossil fuel isn't doing enough to get out of fossil fuel, which is a huge problem. We need far more money for adaptation to the shocks of climate. Far more is paid out in climate finance, the Green Climate Fund and all the rest of it, for mitigation, for reducing the emissions. And yet now the shocks are so real and so terrible around the world that at COP26 there was actually an agreement among the G20 countries, basically, or it wasn't a G20, but the major countries concerned, to double climate adaptation finance by 2025. The trouble is, there doesn't seem to be any plan, there doesn't seem to be any roadmap. It seems to have been said like the 100 billion that we still haven't fully delivered for developing countries. And one of the thorny things at the very end of COP26 was a refusal to have a mechanism, an institutional mechanism for loss and damage, which is the other way that we try to compensate for the injustices of how the climate has played out. And again, that was blocked, and it's back to further dialogue. Now, I have a feeling, and I have a feeling that the developing world and small island states, which are so vulnerable, and all of these shocks from much longer and more heavily hit by climate, then COVID without equitable access to vaccines, now rising costs aggravated by Ukraine. There's going to be a danger of more anger in developing countries if we don't really understand the need to address the justice component of these issues, and to ensure that we have more money for adaptation in particular, and then get serious about loss and damage.
Very good. There were Ivan and Fen, I think, and then this lady at the back, so, and then John. Very good. Okay. So we'll take quick questions because...
I'm not trying to give quick answers.
No, you can give long answers, but we have about 15 minutes to go. Yes, Ivan.
I used to be a high school teacher in Charleston, West Virginia. I used to live next to the Union Miners main house there.
Yeah.
We used to have a sign that said, Union Miners thank Trump. And I was thinking about your wonderful book and the fact that none of the people who work in that building will read your book. And none of their children, who didn't go to my school where I taught it, they went to the other school, will probably read it. And I'm wondering what wisdom you have for people who are invested, who are really inspired by your work. How do we engage with those who will not read these narratives, and maybe should? And what narratives do we have to connect to them to bridge this political gap with people who will grow up to be part of the energy lobby?
It's a very good question, and it's a question that has been certainly addressed in a way that I find very, very interesting by a really good climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe. Catherine Hayhoe is Canadian, but she's based in Texas. And she wrote a book recently called Saving Us. And it's all about her conversation in red states with exactly the people you're talking about, who would not normally have. And it doesn't start with climate. It starts with where you are. And it starts with, and then it gradually comes on. And it's a very, very important book because we all need to do that. And what she says, quite openly in the book is, given what I've been saying about the climate crisis, why don't we talk about it? Because we don't even talk among ourselves about it. We're here this evening because, we're hosted to talk about it. Comparatively few people in our world today think about it every day and talk about it every day. It's increasing. The awareness is increasing, but we actually need to have conversations at every dinner table, in every local authority, and everything, all the time, because this is the issue on which we have to multi-task, think about it, and use culture, use song, use music, use artists, use everything. Imagine this world.
Yes, okay, let me see. There was somebody at the back here, just to let somebody in from the left side, but I think the hand has gone down. Yes, you.
There are a couple of hands there, waving away.
Yeah, Tonka is here and one at the back. Okay, I'll try and get in as many of you as possible.
Thank you so much for your book and for coming and speaking. I loved what you said. You gave us 3 points of things to do, and because I feel frustrated often because I didn't know what to do. So you said to make climate crisis more personal, to get angry with those who aren't doing things, join an NGO, and imagine the world. And I just love those bullets. I'm seeing that more organizations are creating green teams, which is like the grassroots movement that you talk about. But in terms of the NGOs, which ones would you recommend are the most impactful ones to?
Well, there are, a lot of NGOs sort of working in so many different ways, working on conservation, working on nature, working on clean energy, working on, so it depends on whether you want to do it in a development sense of helping developing countries, or whether you want to do it here in Massachusetts. The world actually is very exciting about what is being done all over the world, and there are actually I think she's here in Boston. Mothers against climate. Mothers Out Front. That's the one. Good. Thank you. It's exciting, and I even met a group not so long ago, Angry Grannies, and I felt that's me.
Good. Well, there are two from this side, John and Tunke. Yes. So, John, if you.
Thank you.
Hi.
It's interesting working with fishermen because I think that they would be great advocates for this, because they actually do talk about it all the time.
Yes.
They recognize it and it affects.
Yeah.
They see it on the water and then they see it with the government.
Yeah.
But the issue is that they don't like being lectured by elites.
Yeah.
And this issue has been politicized.
Yes.
And I would argue that it's been politicized by all sides. I'm not denying the facts, but people push the facts one way or the other in order to support their agendas.
Yeah.
And I think that's really keeping a mass movement. My question to you as somebody who's dealt in the upper arenas and negotiate with people, how you possibly depoliticize this issue in a way that we can actually get something done, as opposed to getting stuck.
No, I think you're right, and certainly to the extent that it's politicized in a bad way, that's awful. But I agree, it is too much an elite world, it's too much of a science world, it's too much. That's why I think we do need a broad movement. I think women leaders are in a good position to at least give some leadership on this. And I think I'm not talking about top down. I'm talking about bottom up, top down, and in the middle there's a whole range of women's networks that connect both. And I think one of the points you're implying, which I think is true, is that there's a lack of trust. And I find personally, working with so many other women in the women's leadership, women's networking, and that there's a huge trust. And it's quite significant, and it's precious. And it's because we believe that we're engaged, for good reasons, and that nobody has too much ego, nobody's looking for advantage, nobody's trying to politicize, etc. So I think, we need to do more of that.
Very good. Okay, quick question from Tunkai here in the front, and then your good self, and then we move back here maybe for a last question.
Welcome to the stage, and thank you for this great conversation. I'm from Turkey. I'm a philosopher, and my question will be partly about time. Actually, there are a lot of problems in Turkey too, and so many issues around Anatolia. During these days, activists protesting the plastic import from UA and UK. This stuff is, according to news, non-recyclable waste, and this garbage is interesting. This talking in the most volatile area. I mean, it's historically particularly so important area. My question is, if you ask this to the policymakers, interestingly, they have an answer, and according to them, it's justice. It's not problem. I mean, my question is not justice is changeable term, because justice is a social term. Actually, there is another term which we need, I think, ethics. I mean, although Noble is write a book about wildlife actually around 1949, and he offers another term, land ethics.
Land ethics.
Land ethics.
Land
Land ethics, yeah, which means co-effective a balance actually between the man and the earth.
So Duncan, could you just come to your question, because we have a few more trying to get in.
Yeah, my question is justice exactly good choice or not? Do we not need to ethics?
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for the question. Because I came to understand the impacts of climate through the lens of human rights, working in African countries on economic and social rights, the rights that matter if you don't have them, like to food, water, health, education, etc. I felt the injustice that brought me to the words climate justice. But interestingly enough, when I wanted to have a foundation on climate justice, I was advised by 4 other people, don't use the word justice. A, Americans won't like it. B, and I said, look, to me, I wanted to get away from the idea that climate change, and the fossil fuel lobby tried to promote this, that's kind of just something that happens, you know. We don't want to get too deep into why it happens or who it happens to or who's most affected and who's most responsible, especially who's most responsible. Whereas I find that justice brings out all of those issues. I'm not saying it's a perfect term, I don't, you know, it's just, and I've now noticed that it has become a global way of addressing, you know, especially young people talk all the time about climate justice now, and I'm really very happy about that. Because I think when I went to my first conference on climate in Copenhagen, I couldn't believe how technical, scientific, male-dominated, cold, it was. Nothing about gender, nothing about human rights, nothing about, so I have no apologies. I will continue with the justice. I do agree with you. There's, you know, other ways of maybe, you know, and people do speak about ethics and this and that, they're right, but I just stick to my climate justice.
Very good. So I think there was another question of, look, yeah, these fellas at the back for ages, what am I going to do? We're going to have to break soon because Mary's been on her feet now for an hour and a half.
Take at least one of those ones in the back.
Yeah, I think so too. They have
right
been
at the back.
Right at the back, one right at the back, and maybe a very last one here, and we'll have our reception.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, Mary, as an Irish woman, it's an honour to be with you in this close proximity, listening to you speak. I'm a student from Trinity College Dublin, studying law here in BC Law for the year. And I saw that you recently did work in TCB with the Law Society there on women in law. And I guess my question is, if you were to go back now with your passion for climate justice and starting out as a young lawyer, what direction would you take that would be different?
Well, you know, I think the truth is, when I was a young climate lawyer in Ireland at the time, there were so many issues of discrimination against women that, you know, I found lots to do, but I didn't have any awareness of the climate issue. And, you know, it's interesting for me now, having, you know, looked into it in more detail, to know that it's calculated that somewhere in the 50s, we moved from the, you know, the Holocene Cinderella period of the Earth being our friend and not too hot, not too cold, and, you know, nobody thought that, and all, you know, our human emissions were driving us into the Anthropocene and worse and worse. So, you know, if I was, it would have made a difference if I'd understood that, you know, this was, if I'd had my eyes open earlier. I think if I had, I'd have become passionate earlier about climate justice. As it happens, it was after my time as High Commissioner when I learned from my African friends about how they were being so deeply affected by something that wasn't affecting Ireland, that wasn't affecting the United States in anything like the same way. You know, it was so. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I think I do think that young people today have a great opportunity to see the world differently and to insist on the world being run differently. We cannot continue with this world. We just cannot. The world cannot sustain the way we're going, and that's what scientists are saying to us. We have to, you know, not just cut the emissions, but also cut the consumption, cut the waste, and enjoy doing that. I mean, when I was growing up, we learned to mend, we learned to sew, we learned to darn. I had 4 brothers, I was the only girl. My brothers handed down all their clothes. I was lucky, I thought, you know. But, you know, it was a different world. We never wasted anything. And the idea of drinking out of plastic bottles, we've now got a treaty on plastic. So that's a success. The other success that's worth talking about is we had a crisis a bit like climate a number of years ago, the ozone layer. I'm sure many of you think that was really, really serious, but we knew what was causing it, and because it was so serious, we solved it. It's the only so-called planetary boundary that we have retrieved. Of the 9 planetary boundaries, that's the one we got back into sync. We need to pull back on the others because 4 of them were in the red already. You know, so you know, I think for young people, you know, there's so many things you can do, and we need you.
Good. We have many, many questions from left and right here. I'm just going to take one last one here, and to say to everybody, yes, I'll take your hand up there. If you could, Nathan, if you could give this lady at the back, yeah, with the hand up. Just to remind you that there is a reception which will open in Hey Sesame in 2 minutes here on the right, and Mary will be remaining on and will, I'm sure, be happy to talk further with you and sign your books. I know some of you have books for her to sign. So the conversation will continue, but the formal part of it, I think, will end after this question, if that's all right with you, Mary. So yes, your question.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here today and speaking with us. I was wondering briefly what your thoughts on the investment were and Boston College's lack of divestment from fossil fuels, even though students have been demanding change for approximately a decade.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
I was wondering what your thoughts on divestment were and Boston College's lack of divestment.
Oh, divestment.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I think, you know, universities are thought leaders. They should be leading in every sense on this issue because, you know, it is a crisis. I have, you know, for a long time supported the idea of universities, including my old alma mater, the Harvard, divesting. I think they're making some progress now. I got Trinity College in Dublin to start a process of divesting a few years ago, but it wasn't actually me so much as I was Chancellor at the time, so I was, you know, and the students started a real protest, and the president was called the Provost in Trinity, was caught in the middle between the Chancellor and the students, and he decided, and I put him on to the Wallace Foundation, to Ellen Dorsey in the Wallace Foundation. I don't know whether anybody in Boston College has consulted the Wallace Foundation. The universities find it difficult. There's a lot of blended finance. It's not easy, but what you do is you make the commitment and then you work out. You know, and I think all universities should be doing that now, that have any kind of endowments, all colours, because they should not be invested in what's destroying us, you know, period. But I do accept that people have, you know, there are employees, there are pensions to be thought about, there's all kinds of complicated things. It's not easy, but so many have been able to do it and they've never regretted it. And also to move into investing in renewables, if possible, is also another part of because we need as much investment as possible in renewables. And I'm conscious that I've been saying some very tough things, and I'm worried that I'm not fulfilling Mandela's mandate. Can I tell my tutu story?
Please.
Yeah, okay. I was on panel with Archbishop Tutu, certainly maybe 15 years ago now, in New York. It was a social good panel with young people on their phones and their iPads, etc. And you know, Archbishop Tutu and myself, I was an elder at the time, and he was chair. Neither of us were terribly social media conscious, and but when Archbishop Tutu is in front of young people, he loves them, throws up his arms, and all the rest of it. And we were being moderated by an American journalist, and she said quite sharply, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he turned to her and he said, "Oh no, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And you know, those words really struck home to me because, you know, I could see what he meant, and we talked about it afterwards. You have to be a prisoner of hope because that gives you the energy to do the next step. What's the next thing you can do? You can fix something, you know. Whereas if you talk about climate and I can't even pronounce the word apocalyptic way, all the energy goes out of the room. Yeah. And people actually put their head down and say, well, there's nothing I can do about it, so I'll just carry on with my life. Whereas this is saying, you know, we all, you know, humanity is at a stage where we all are vested in wanting to do something about it. We move with the heart rather than the statistics in the head, and we get it done. And that's the prisoner of hope.
And on that note of hope, we give great thanks to Mary Robinson. Thank you, Mary. You were great. Well done. There you are.
I got a song.